There is a silence that follows the scream. Long after the blood has dried and the body has stiffened, a silence that settles in the corners of stone chambers like breath held too long. In that silence, a queen whispers to no one, not to God, not to her husband, only to the walls that have already watched 6 women die in royal beds. The 7th did not die at the scaffold. She died slower, smiling through rot, holding a child as fever peeled her from the inside. That is the mercy she received. That is the horror she deserved. Catherine Parr was not the softest wife, but she was the last, the one who survived Henry, the one who outlived the axe. But the court knew, and so did the child she bore, that not every blade is made of steel. Some are made of secrets, of ink, of whispered regrets. Some are women who bleed behind closed doors and are told it is an honor. Her body had already been handed to history, yet her mind lingered, lucid and burning, like candle wax dripping onto bone. She spoke of faith. They said she was holy. She wrote prayers. They called it obedience. But beneath the prayer book was a woman bound tighter than a corpse. Her breath smelled of lavender and bile. Her fingers trembled not from age, but from knowing, for she knew. She knew what it meant to be crowned by a man who murdered his love with a kiss. She knew what it meant to nurse a tyrant as he decayed in velvet. She knew that to survive Henry VIII was to carry his ghost inside your womb, and that even after his death, his name was the plague that kept spreading. They call it childbirth. They call it complications. But if you listen closely, not to the records, but to the cold air in Sudeley Castle, you will hear her begging in perfect silence. Not to live, not to be remembered, but to finally sleep without dreaming of the king. She was neither beautiful nor plain, not radiant enough to inspire poetry, nor dull enough to be forgotten. Catherine Parr existed in that cruel middle space where survival masqueraded as virtue. She was composed, deliberate, her hands always folded just so, her voice practiced to a calm that concealed the erosion beneath. The court called her learned. They praised her for her piety, for her loyalty, for her gentle correction of a monstrous king's soul. But none saw the marrow of her restraint, the way she breathed through the decay of power, through the stench of infection that clung to the air like mold, through the iron rattle of footsteps outside her door when she read in secret the words of the Reformation. She did not rise to the throne on the winds of romance or conquest. She rose because the other queens had fallen, some headless, some barren, some too beloved to be endured. And Catherine, the widow twice over, smiled and nodded, said the right things in Latin and in prayer, and entered the bed of a dying tyrant like a lamb stepping into the darkened altar. Her coronation was not a celebration, it was a delay of execution. She ruled over a court heavy with ghosts. Jane Seymour's shadow haunted the nursery. Anne Boleyn's blood still whispered in the hall tapestries, and even the living queens left behind silence where conversation should have bloomed. Catherine walked softly, as if not to disturb the spirits, as if each breath might crack the illusion of stability that the court clung to like a drug. Henry was bloated by then, his leg a foul-smelling wound wrapped in velvet, his eyes bloodshot, his temper soaked in wine and suspicion. He wanted obedience, but also comfort. Catherine gave both, but never entirely. She spoke of God with a tenderness that disarmed his fury. But beneath her words was fire, the fire of a woman who had read Erasmus, who had held Tyndale's banned translation in her lap, who had dreamed of a faith that did not bow before the whims of flesh-crowned kings. The courtiers watched her closely. Every syllable she uttered was dissected. Every book in her chamber was weighed not for its weight, but for its treason. And still she endured. For she knew that queens did not live through strength, but through silence, the kind of silence that bends without breaking, that listens without revealing, that bleeds without staining the sheets. Yet even in that silence, she wrote. Her prayers were bound in leather. Her reflections published under a false name. Her devotion couched in ambiguity, sharp enough to be safe and vague enough to be gospel. She became the queen of appearances, her gowns stitched tighter than armor, her headdress pulled low over a brow furrowed in quiet calculation, every smile a mask, every gesture a calculation. And all around her, the court played its game, lords and ladies pirouetting over trapdoors, jesters with knives in their sleeves, bishops sniffing out heresy like hounds on the scent of warm blood. They envied her, not for her place in the king's bed, but for her intellect, for the way she wielded words like a scalpel. And in their envy, they began to whisper. They remembered how Anne Boleyn had spoken of reform. They recalled how Catherine Howard had smiled too often. They wondered if Catherine Parr, so devout, so composed, might one day become something more dangerous, a woman with a pen sharper than any sword. The king, in his decay, grew paranoid. His moods shifted like clouds before a storm. He spoke of betrayal even in sleep. He stared at his wife as if waiting for her to change shape. And so Catherine adapted. She kissed the ulcers on his leg. She laughed when summoned. She praised his righteousness while wiping the drool from his chin. But in private, she wept. Not loudly, not desperately, but in the way a prisoner weeps when the key is shown to them, only to be swallowed again by the jailer. Her chambermaids heard her prayers, but never the trembling that followed. Her confessor blessed her lips, but never the words she dared not say aloud. In the early morning hours, when the castle was still and the air thick with smoke from dying fires, Catherine would sit at the edge of her bed and watch the frost claim the window glass, tracing veins across it like cracks in bone. It was in those moments that she remembered herself, not as queen, but as daughter, as widow, as woman. She had loved before Henry, once with innocence, once with hope. But now, love had become survival, a game played in silence, with no promise of escape. The court praised her gentleness. They spoke of her as a healer of wounds, but even they did not see that her hands, steady and white, had learned to soothe not out of kindness, but from habit. She had learned to clean pus from royal ulcers, to remove bloodstains from royal sheets, to smile while death sat beside her like an old companion. Her power was not in titles, nor in lands, nor in favor. Her power was in endurance, the power to remain whole while others fractured, the power to remain unburned in a world of pyres. But power, no matter how quietly worn, breeds enemies. And Catherine, with her calm voice and hidden thoughts, had begun to stir the fear of men who preferred queens without minds. Bishops watched her closely. Spies were planted in her household. Her words were copied, her books examined, her servants questioned. The king's confessor warned her not to overstep. The Lord Chancellor gave her sermons disguised as threats. And still, she endured. Still, she wrote. Still, she prayed in the margins of forbidden texts. There was a moment brief, almost lost to time, when the king had a warrant drawn for her arrest. They called it heresy. They named her a danger. But she, clever and desperate, fell at his feet and begged for forgiveness, not for what she had done, but for what he had imagined. And Henry, flattered by her submission, tore the warrant himself. She had won, but the damage was done. Her chambers were never the same. The walls listened more closely. The floorboards creaked with suspicion, and Catherine truly knew that she was not the last wife by divine mercy, but by a thread barely held together by performance. When Henry died, bloated and alone, she did not weep. She did not pray over his corpse. She simply packed her thoughts away into journals and left. They called her lucky. They called her the survivor. But what they never understood was that survival carves deeper scars than execution. In the absence of the axe, She bore the weight of memory. She carried the breath of 5 queens whose ends had come faster than hers. And still, she walked forward into a future shaped by the past's rot, into a new marriage, into a new court, into a world that saw her not as a queen, but as a relic. She bore a child. She wore new silk. She smiled again. But deep inside, where words were no longer written, where thoughts had turned to ash, she felt the cold fingers of the old king still wrapped around her throat. His name followed her. His crown haunted her. His blood had soaked too deeply into the stones of her silence to ever be washed away. And in the dark corners of her chamber, the prayers continued quieter now, less hopeful, more resigned. Not for salvation, not even for peace, but for something colder, for forgetfulness, for the mercy of obscurity, for the end to come not as a scream, but as a whisper. The quiet did not last, not in the way she had hoped, for queens do not dissolve into the ether. They rot slowly under watchful eyes, and the scent draws predators. After Henry's death, she had become more than widow, she had become inheritance, a walking memory of a monarchy that fed on wives, her skin still perfumed with the ghosts of palaces, her womb still considered useful. And so, as England mourned its monstrous king, Catherine Parr remarried not for power, not for ambition, but for a pulse she thought might resemble freedom. Thomas Seymour, brother to the dead Queen Jane and uncle to the fragile boy now crowned king, whispered sweetness into her emptiness, offered her laughter in place of scripture, hunger in place of ritual. But Catherine was not naive. Not then, not after years of kneeling beside royal decay. She knew what ambition tasted like, sweet wine laced with slow poison, and yet she drank it. Perhaps she hoped love might undo what the crown had done to her bones. But Seymour was not built for love. He was built for appetite. He wanted what she possessed access, legacy, the illusion of innocence. He played courtship like a soldier sharpening a dagger, each touch rehearsed, each glance calibrated to disarm. And when he entered her chambers, it was not as a husband, but as a spy who had been given keys to a locked library. The castle grew colder in those months, not from winter, but from something more intimate betrayal wrapped in velvet. Catherine, now heavy with child, began to sense the shape of the trap. Servants fell silent when she passed. Letters were intercepted. The young Princess Elizabeth, once under her protection, had begun to pull away her eyes distant. Her words clipped. Something had shifted, and Catherine, with her scholar's mind and her widow's instinct, began to piece together the shadows. Seymour's flirtation with the young princess had not been innocent. His touches had lingered. His gifts had meanings. Catherine had watched it unfold like a play in which she herself had been cast as the foolish wife. She had spoken gently at first, masking her horror in maternal concern. But Elizabeth, only a girl and already shaped by treachery, remained silent, and Seymour, arrogant and blinded by his own delusions of charm, only grew bolder. Catherine knew what must come next, not confrontation, but containment. She sent Elizabeth away, not as punishment, but as protection. But the damage had already slipped through the cracks. The whispers returned, the same kind that had followed her through Henry's court. This time, they questioned her judgment, her morality, her ability to control the dangerous passions of men and girls alike. She had gone from queen to liability, from saint to spectacle, and all the while, Seymour plotted. He had set his eyes not only on Catherine, but on the throne itself. The boy king was young, vulnerable, and surrounded by vultures. Seymour wanted the regency. He wanted power. He wanted to replace the dead king's memory with his own image. Catherine became an inconvenience. Too wise, too watchful, too slow to forget, and the child growing within her a girl. they whispered would only complicate his ambitions. He no longer kissed her forehead. He no longer sat at her side when she bled from the gums. He no longer touched her swollen belly with anything but indifference. Catherine's nights became riddled with fever. Not from illness, but from dread. Her dreams were broken mosaics of past executions and future abandonment. Anne Boleyn's eyes, hollow and staring. Catherine Howard's screams behind velvet curtains. Jane Seymour's cold hands pressed over a royal cradle. The past queens visited her in her sleep, each one pulling at her soul like roots beneath frozen soil, and Seymour remained absent, too busy courting favor with nobles, too busy building the ladder he hoped would raise him above God. The child arrived in a storm of blood and smoke. Catherine screamed, not from pain, but from knowing. Her body, once cloaked in royal silks, was now bare and shaking on a birthing bed in Sudeley Castle. No trumpets, no candles, only shadows. And the child, a daughter, was born pale and quiet, her lungs slow to cry, as if she too sensed the futility of birth in a kingdom built on widowhood. Catherine, drenched in sweat and milk, looked at her baby with eyes that no longer saw promise. She did not weep. She did not rejoice. She whispered a name, Mary, and closed her eyes. But death did not come gently. It came in stages. Fever curled around her spine like ivy. Her skin, once smooth as parchment, blistered in silence. Her lips, once quick with prayer, turned black with rot. The midwives crossed themselves but dared not speak. They had seen this before. Childbed fever, the punishment of Eve. But to Catherine, it was retribution. Not from heaven, but from history. The body that had survived Henry had finally betrayed her. Not to execution, not to politics, but to flesh, to heat, to filth. Her husband did not sit beside her. He was gone, chasing power in London, whispering false loyalties into the ears of men with sharper blades. And Catherine, burning alive in her own skin, began to speak aloud to the queens who had come before her. She called them sisters. She asked if the fire would stop once the breath was gone. She asked if God would remember her as she truly was, not as queen, not as wife, but as the girl who had once walked alone by the sea, before the crowns, before the rot, before the silence. Her attendants wiped her brow, but her eyes did not see them. Her mind had already begun to unweave the fabric of the world, and in the corner of the room, she saw Henry fat, limping, grinning, his leg oozing, his crown crooked. He was not dead. He was always watching, even in death. His ghost ruled. Her final words were not to her husband, nor her child, nor her God. They were a warning not spoken, but mouthed, a shape of lips, a whisper beneath the breath. He is still here. And then silence. No scream, no trumpet, only the wind curling through the stone corridors of Sudeley Castle, carrying with it the scent of milk and rot and regret. Seymour returned too late. He did not weep, he did not kneel. He ordered her body buried with modest grace. No state funeral, no gilded coffin, just a widow's grave for a widow's wife. But even in death, Catherine Parr was not silent. Her journals remained. Her books survived. Her enemies read her words and saw themselves reflected. Seymour, in his greed, overstepped. He broke into the king's chamber. He threatened the regency, and for this, they executed him. Not for betrayal, not for lust, but for arrogance. His head fell from his shoulders before the year ended, and Catherine, beneath the earth, did not move. But one imagines if bones can smile, she did. Her body was placed beneath the stone floor of a chapel that echoed even the breath of ghosts, sealed not with royal pageantry, but with the indifference reserved for those who have outlived their usefulness. A slab of marble bore her name, carved without flourish, without triumph, without sorrow. Just letters and dust, and yet the air there never stopped murmuring. For the dead queen did not rest. She unraveled slowly beneath the earth, not in peace but in memory. Those who passed her grave never lingered long. Something in the cold of the stone seemed to breathe. Something in the air tasted faintly of blood and ink. Her books remained, tucked in corners of libraries that rarely welcomed women's hands. And in them, her voice persisted clear, measured, relentless. Not a voice of confession or apology, but one of defiant reflection. In her prose, she was no longer the silent consort. She was a mind peeling back the veil of divine tyranny. A woman who dared to think in a world built on obedience. Yet few read them then. The world was eager to forget Catherine Parr, eager to tuck her behind the more theatrical ghosts of Henry's wives. Behind Anne Boleyn's scandal and Catherine Howard's horror, behind Jane Seymour's martyrdom. Catherine had lived too long, survived too well, and in doing so, had committed the quietest crime of all she had endured without permission. But legacies do not die with flesh. They ferment, decay into potency. And so, her child, a girl born in a room already thick with death, was left to the world as a half-formed echo. Mary Seymour, named for ghosts, vanished into history with no monument, no marriage, no known breath beyond infancy. Some say she died in the cradle, her mother's fever clinging to her bones like a curse. Others whisper she was hidden away, too dangerous as a symbol, too fragile to be allowed to grow. But Catherine's legacy was never meant to be born in blood. It was meant to linger in margins, in unwritten letters, in the spaces between remembered queens. Her name slipped from royal mouths, but found root in the quiet rebellion of minds she had touched young Elizabeth. For one who had watched her, learned from her, remembered her, not in public, not in declarations, but in posture, in restraint, in the power to survive without shouting. Elizabeth, too, had seen the fire behind Catherine's eyes, the intelligence cloaked in patience, and as she grew, as she ascended the throne with a caution that mirrored Catherine's silence, one could almost see the echo, the same careful hands, the same deliberate gaze, the same refusal to surrender the mind in exchange for safety. Catherine Parr became a shadow in Elizabeth's reign, not spoken of, but never far. The last wife of Henry VIII, the one who wrote when others begged, the one who survived a king and died from life itself. The court that had once measured her worth in proximity to power now forgot her completely. No feasts were held in her honor. No chapel sermons remembered her voice, but she remained in the flickering candlelight over her books, in the bitter scent of herbs in unused corridors, in the way certain servants refused to speak her name near the nursery where she had once prayed for safety. History does not treat quiet women kindly. It prefers spectacle, scandal, skin torn from bone. But Catherine gave it none. She died as she lived, with a mind full of fire and a mouth full of silence. Yet the fire escaped. It flickered through generations, unseen but warm. Reformers quoted her without attribution. Queens ruled with her restraint, and those who read her prayers in the dark found, in her words, not comfort, but a mirror. A woman who understood that survival is not noble. It is necessary, that obedience, when practiced by the thinking, becomes subversion. That love, when offered by the dying, is a weapon sharper than betrayal. The final days of Catherine Parr did not end when her body decayed. They stretched into centuries. They echoed through locked rooms in which other women sat, writing, thinking, waiting. Each queen who came after bore something of her, not her name, not her fate, but her silence. And in that silence, Catherine had buried a warning that kings rot but words remain, that crowns fall, but wounds remember, that behind every obedient smile may lie a sharpened thought, and behind every forgotten queen, a future waiting to be written. Even now, her grave lies quiet in Gloucestershire, beneath cold stone and faded hymns. But no ivy grows there, no birds nest in its shadow. And when the wind creeps through the chapel at dusk, it carries not song, but breath shallow, measured, whispering only what cannot be buried. They buried her in silence. But silence is not the absence of sound, it is a presence all its own, a coiled thing, a whisper with teeth, and in that silence, Catherine Parr remains. Not as flesh, not as queen, but as a question left unanswered. Her grave holds no crown, no relic, no child, only breath that was never returned, only prayers written in hands that bled. The chapel forgets nothing. Each stone remembers her fever. Each beam groans under the weight of her final breath. There is no justice, no vengeance, only the slow crawl of memory through centuries of dust. Beneath the marble, her bones dream of fire, not the fire of martyrdom, but the slow, internal fire of knowing. Knowing what they did, knowing what they feared, knowing that her mind was the most dangerous thing she ever carried. The child died, the husband perished, the crown moved on, but the thought remained. And thought, when buried, becomes seed. No monument marks her rebellion. No choir sings her name. But somewhere in the corners of old libraries, her words still shiver on the page. Somewhere, a woman reads them in silence and does not forget. So now you know the ending, or think you do. A fever, a grave, a name etched in stone. But endings are only the parts we choose to remember. Catherine Parr did not end. She was erased, and erasure, too, is a form of murder. But murder leaves behind ghosts, and her ghost does not scream. It waits, it watches, it breathes in cold places where history dares not look. And if you ever find yourself there, alone, listening, you will hear it. The softest breath, the sharpest thought, the queen who would not die quietly,